Hello, can you hear me?
Hello and welcome to a new podcast, giving a voice to the diverse talent working to improve health and care for people in West Yorkshire and Harrogate, presented by our Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff network. In episode 3, network member Usha Kaushal, lead pharmacist and operational lead at Yorkshire Ambulance Service, gets topical with a discussion on white privilege and the Black Lives Matter movement with Samantha Allen, Chief Executive of Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, with Wallace Sampson, Chief Executive of Harrogate Borough Council, and Rob Webster, Chief Executive at South West Yorkshire Partnership Foundation Trust and lead CEO for West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership.
Like me, I'm sure you all were very saddened to see the untimely deaths of so many of our BAME staff due to disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on our BAME colleagues and communities. And I think on top of this, I think what's been happening in America, I think my feelings have oscillated between numbness, shock, disbelief as this story has unfolded. I think these events have perhaps brought to light the inequalities and the disparities that are experienced by BAME citizens on a daily basis to the forefront and to the attention of our leadership. And I've had colleagues, I've had friends, probably like yourselves, who from non-BAME backgrounds have contacted me, contacted colleagues, questioning themselves about why they've not noticed these issues beforehand, and they're wanting to understand more about white privilege and how perhaps they can use this understanding that they're going to gain as a positive force. So perhaps to begin with, my first question is, and I think that goes to you, Rob, is what does white privilege mean?
White privilege, I think, was epitomised for me this week in a conversation we were having at the board. So we invited in the trust for staff from the organiser just to come and talk to us in a listening session. So we said, we're not here to solve any problems, just want to listen to what you've got to tell us. And one of them said, really powerfully, I think, she said, when I was about 11 or 12, my parents told me that I'm going to have to work harder than all the people in my school because of the colour of my skin. And being a teenager, being 11 or 12 and then being a teenager, kept saying this and I just ignored them. I thought they were wrong. What do you know? What do you know about all this? I know better. And she said, after 30 years in the service, I can tell you they were right. People like me don't have to put up with that, do they? People like me don't have to endure the microaggressions that wear people down every day because people make assumptions, often negative, based on the colour of their skin. And one of the other members of staff, we've got a mixed board, it's in gender terms and ethnicity terms and everything else. But another member of staff said, I've spent 30 years wanting to walk in your shoes. I'd really like you to spend just a day walking in mine. And if we did, I think we'd understand as white people, we carry a certain amount of privilege, which is invisible to us much of the time.
Yeah, and it's that lived experience that you're talking about. Sam, would you like to come in on that as well and just comment on what does white privilege mean for you?
Yeah, it was, I suppose it was a term that I only really kind of noticed and started to become familiar with a couple of years ago. And it was on the back of our equality and diversity lead coming to our trust board and giving every single one of us on the board Rennie Edo Lodge's book on why I'm not talking to white people about race anymore. So I started to read that book, and my goodness, it kind of blew me away. But I'd never heard the term white privilege before. I wasn't aware of it, and started to try and understand it. I suppose more recently, and the Channel 4 series around the school that tried to end racism, there's a really, which I just think is a challenging programme to watch, and one I would really recommend to try and understand this issue. And they've got this clip in there where they've got the kids lined up to start a race. But instead of starting the race with everybody at level on the starting line, they say they're going to ask a few questions, and then the questions they ask are, has your mum or dad ever had to talk to you about racism and prepare you for that? Take a step backwards if that's the case. Do you know any of your relatives who've been stopped and searched by the police without good cause or reason? Take another step back. And then it goes on and on and on. And you end up in a situation where quite clearly the Black and Asian kids are 3, 4, 5 further steps back from their white counterparts. And I think what it really shows is, I think as a white person, we don't have to live with the racial stresses that are put on life and the disadvantages, really. And I was not aware of that. I had no idea. I've been a chief executive for nearly 4 years, the first 2 of those years as a chief executive. I didn't understand this term. I wasn't conscious of it. I didn't even get or understand my own privilege. And I think also, I suppose just the final thing I'd say is that as a white person, I've been in rooms with other white people. Whiteness and talking about whiteness is uncomfortable. It's not something we are used to, We talk about BAME people. We do not comfortably talk about whiteness. And I think also being a white person, and you mentioned I'm a Yorkshire lass. I was born in Yorkshire. My granddad was a miner, in Wakefield. We're working class roots. So white privilege doesn't necessarily undermine the struggles that you also have as a white person. It's different. And I'm still learning about this through conversation.
I'd like to, it's right, and it must have been quite shocking for those school students as they saw their colleagues moving back, and when you look at, you're in this classroom, there's meant to be a certain level of equality there, but when you look as it goes back, that equality and the equity becomes apparent. And I think that's really important, what you've actually just described. And Wallace, I'd like to now bring you in, and as a member of the BME community, I know, I know what white privilege means to me, and I'm sure you probably will have had very similar experiences that I have. So, I'd like to put that question to you now, Wallace. What does white privilege mean to you?
Well, it's taken the very unjust and unlawful killing of George Floyd to bring this conversation to the fore. And in some respects, I'm pleased that we're having this conversation. We're not afraid to have this conversation really about white privilege. And I think it's really important that we understand exactly what that means. And, certainly for me and everybody from a Black and ethnic minority community, I think it reflects really the disadvantages that we feel that we've had in society all our lives, and our parents and generations before them and generations before them, purely because of the colour of their skin. So I think it's a really important conversation to have. I think for me, it probably manifests itself really in what I'd call the unconscious bias that I feel that I felt really all the way through my life, just because I happen to be from a Black and minority ethnic community, and the struggle that I think that I've had to endure all my life, really, just to make sure that I'm at least on a level playing field. And I think that's why this whole conversation about white privilege is really important, really. Because we need to have that honest conversation and recognise that whilst people who are white may come from disadvantaged communities, they don't come from disadvantaged communities because they are white. there are other social factors that play into that conversation, but not because they are white. Whereas with people from a black and minority ethnic community, in many instances, that disadvantages actually starts from colour, rather than necessarily from the other social inequalities that they may face. So I think that's why this particular conversation is really important to me, and it's important that we have that very open and honest conversation about it, and recognise that for Black people, it is a fact that we have had to live with all of our lives, and it is about making sure that the fact that we are either Black or from a minority ethnic background doesn't actually set us further back on that level playing field to start with.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think, for me, I think it's been really difficult, as well. And listening to these conversations, it does actually reiterate a lot of what you've experienced, I've experienced. And then there's the other angle as well, because I am from a BME background, but my husband is English and I have children of a mixed race. And then when you throw all that into perspective and you look at how you educate your children to be systemically aware that racism exists, but then, for their own daily protection, but also then to make them aware that perhaps people may not agree with your parents' life choices to have mixed race children. And it just throw that, and you've got to be very sensitive to the needs as well. And I think, part of, as there is certain privileges of being BAME, there's privileges of being white. And I think perhaps my second question, what I'd like to ask is, Sam, you've said that, you've got privilege, and how do you actually use that privilege to make an impactful change, to understand where you can use perhaps your voice and your position to amplify the voice of BAME communities?
So I suppose when you're a chief executive of an NHS organisation, you're in public service, you're leading an organisation. The organisation I lead, we've got 5,000 colleagues that work together within that, but we're part of a broader health and care system, we're part of our communities. And I think it's really important that we use our power to dismantle some of the structural aspects that create the society that we've got now. I think it's important that we use our leadership roles to role model through these conversations, bringing this to the fore. I think something, again, that I see particularly around the discomfort around white fragility that Robin DiAngelo writes about is the silence, through the fear and the guilt. So we've got to tackle this, I think. We've got to tackle it head on, speaking up and out. It's been great to partner with Rob and Navina Evans, on a couple of blogs recently through the NHS Confederation. I also chair the Health and Care Women Leaders Network, again, thinking about intersectionality, and different aspects of that, using those platforms to enable other people to have a platform and bring this issue to the fore. So it's for me, it's about trying to use every opportunity as a leader in my work, as a mum outside of work, whether it's in conversations with my son and his friends, and my family on this issue as well, because I think lots of people are in different places. So I think it's about really thinking about how you can use your role and your influence and different ways of speaking up. Yeah,
and that's really important. And I did notice that you did mention the subject of white fragility, and I'd like to perhaps discuss that a little bit more, and I'd like to give Rob the opportunity to just come in on how he uses his privilege to perhaps, or make an impactful change, and understanding where he can use his voice and position to amplify the voice of BAME communities.
I think Sam's right. I'd start from a very personal perspective. I think about sitting with your discomfort. And I think, Andrew Ibrahim's got that. I think everybody's seen this model now, which I think is really impactful, about how you become anti-racist. And part of that is about sitting with the discomfort of this, that you've been living in and amongst this for so long. and it's been hidden in plain sight. And if you can own that and say, look, you know what, this is real. As Sam said, this is a class-ridden country. And when you talk about privilege, people confuse that with class. This isn't a class issue. This is about white privilege and the advantages we get just from being white, and that they are real and they've been hidden in plain sight. So the first thing is you've really got to own that, because as a leader, authenticity is key. And if people don't think you're authentic, they won't believe you. So you've got to believe it yourself. Now once you have, I think Andrew Foster once said to me something really powerful, I thought, which was, as a chief exec, you've only really got two things you can choose yourself. One is how you tell the story of your organisation, and the other is how you choose to personally spend your time. And I think what I would say is, for this agenda, we have to make it part of the story of our organisation and our system. And then we personally have to choose to spend our time on it. And by doing that, I think you then open up a whole load of opportunities to make a difference.
Wallace, would you like to come in that you are in a position that a lot of us would vie for, essentially looking at you've made it, and there is some privilege there. And how do you think you use your privilege of where you are to actually make an impactful change, do you think, and perhaps to amplify the voice of BAME colleagues and communities?
Yeah, well, I think Rob made a very valid point about it starting from within, and from me, it absolutely starts from within. I do resonate with that point, and I think for me, the starting point is that the privilege that I feel really emanates from the sacrifices that I know that my parents had to make for me. We started from a very impoverished social background, literally two families living in one house. And actually to progress to get in a council house was seen as a massive progression for us as a family. And eventually we were able to buy our own home. And actually within the Black community, we were seen as advantaged rather than disadvantaged. But that shouldn't belittle the degree of sacrifice, really, that had to be made by my parents, really, to give us that start in society. And I suppose that goes back to the original point about white privilege and how, people from a white background don't necessarily have to go through that type of sacrifice to be able to get to that same point in time. And because of that, I think that it has really strengthened my desire to be a role model, and to be a role model, certainly for people that come from a Black and minority ethnic background, but actually to also be a role model from everybody that faces social disadvantage. And that is really important. So using forums like this, I think, is an opportunity to help to make that impactful change and to provide a platform and a voice for people from BAME communities to be able to say, crikey, there's a Black chief executive here. If he can do it, hopefully I can do it, and use it as an inspiration. Definitely championing and challenging where it's necessary. I think that that's really important in terms of making impactful change. But I think also there needs to be a strength of mentality where you don't actually see yourself as a victim, and you see yourself as a real positive force for good, and a real inspiration. And that's what I strive to try and do. As I said right at the start of this podcast, there are quite literally, no more than a handful of Black chief executives in local government today. And actually, if you looked at the wider public sector, including the health service, you're probably talking about another handful at best at that level within the public sector. So it's really important that people like me and other colleagues that have achieved this type of level of success are seen as a really positive voice for good, but we don't see ourselves as a victim, we see ourselves as a positive voice for good.
You're listening to Can You Hear Me? The West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership BAME Network podcast.
That lived experience, those stories are really important, because I think listening to the understanding and the empathy that I've just heard in your voice, I think it's really important that we start to have those conversations around race and equality without, fears of repercussions. It's like you've got to bring your authentic self to work. That's the only way we can actually make sure that the services we deliver are really, very effective. And going back to you, Wallace, I think you're right. And being able to have those conversations is really important. But I think there's always that case where people will turn around and say, I'm really worried about saying the wrong thing. And you've picked up on that perhaps we shouldn't victimize ourselves. We shouldn't play the victim. So you've mentioned, how we can better essentially educate ourselves to speak up about sensitive issues. And one of the things you've said is not to play the victim. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to that?
I think, and this is where I think people like me and Rob and others have got a really important leadership role to play, because it's also for me about values and behaviours. And it's about our own individual values and behaviours that we demonstrate on a day-by-day basis and that we aspire to. And it's also about the values and behaviours that we culture and cultivate within our individual organisations, so that we actually develop an environment where it's okay to have a view, it's okay to have a different view, it's okay to have a voice that might not necessarily be shared by the person that's sat next to you. But the really important thing is that you can have that conversation. And I suppose a good example of that for me recently actually was in a recent blog that I put out within my organisation. I always like to add a little bit of a personal dimension to my blog. And I was talking about the fact that my son has recently been awarded a scholarship to go to college in the USA. And he had a number of offers, including offers from colleges in the southern states. And he decided against it and chose a college in New Jersey, actually. And one of the reasons why he chose a northern college rather than one in the southern states was because of the racism that he knows exists in the southern parts of the USA. And now actually one of my colleagues wrote back to me and said that they were affronted that I had labelled half of the USA as racist. Yeah. And I think the positive that came out of that for me was that the culture that exists in our organisation was one that somebody felt it was okay actually to challenge the chief executive on that. The important thing was that there's a culture there within the organisation where it was okay to have that conversation. And so for me, that's really important. There's the values and the behaviours that we live and breathe every day. And as a leader, how we actually embed that within our organisation.
And I think that's really important actually, because it's actually having that understanding. And I think I'd like to bring Sam and Robin on this as well. How do we actually have these difficult conversations? Going back, to that question about we're worried about saying the wrong thing, but how do we proactively call people out around this? And how do we host these often difficult conversations? And I think I'd like to come to you, Sam, with that first, please.
It's not all that long ago that somebody said to me, as a leader in the health service, if you choose to focus on that area race or gender, then you're going to have a pretty limited career. And that was a kind of a real sort of fear within the system, really. I think some of that reflects on the fact, the level of discomfort that people have in talking about this, understanding it. I think it also reflects on culture and psychological safety. So one of the things that we're really trying to focus on in the organisation I work in is around creating what we're calling psychological safe cultures. And it is that whole thing around authenticity. Can you bring your full self to work? So without fear of being judged, without fear of consequences, without fear of speaking up. And what I would say is, having done a lot of listening recently to both the really good, the not so good, and some of the damn right ugly, actually, that happens, is we've got a real mosaic of cultures that exists out there, and there are subcultures. So we mustn't kid ourselves either as leaders, because we're having these conversations, everybody else is, and everybody else is comfortable to have them or feels safe having them. And I think also it's like anything that's kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit. There'll be the minority that are comfortable and want to talk about it, and then there will be a group that are either in denial. And after George Floyd died, and a message that I sent out across the organisation, I had some really mixed responses, and a couple of them wanted to tell me that in the 25 years that they'd worked in the health service and in our organisation, they'd never witnessed or experienced racism. So it was sort of this isn't happening here. You don't have to worry. And I thought, well, that might be your experience, but I know that's not everybody's experience. So yeah, I think it's really important that we say to people, we're going to get some of this wrong. I might offend you. You might offend me, but we're human, actually. Can we seek to understand each other, not judge each other, and work through this together? But most importantly, listen and really, really hear. And we've got a lot of work to do. This is not going to be something at pace. The NHS, we love our action plans, as I'm sure Wallace will know. We like doing things quickly. This is going to be 20, 30 years of work. And, I use the Nelson Mandela quote, which I just love, which is, it's one thing to change society, but it's another to change yourself. And so it's that deep work on self, really, and then psychologically safe teams. And I think we'll have better outcomes for our community, more satisfied people at work if we can really work on this together.
Yeah. Well, how do we actually proactively, and I'm going to use that term, call out and have those difficult conversations? Because we've got to step up to the mark, essentially. I think it's not enough in 2020 to just say these things happen. We've got policies, procedures, they're not working.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to be able to have these type of conversations without fear of consequence. And that's why, going back to the point about the environment that you create within your own organisations is really, really important. And for the three of us that's on the podcast today, that's where we play a really important leadership role, because unless we create that environment where you can have those conversations that's almost without fear of consequence, we can't get to that point of really understanding. So, the points that were made earlier about seeking to understand by both Sam and Rob is really, really important. But you can't seek to understand if people feel that they can't, share their views and join in the conversation without fear of consequence. So I suppose in some respects, it links back to the earlier point about values and behaviours, and the values and behaviours that we have as individuals, but also the values and behaviours that we aspire to have within our organisations. Because ultimately, I do think that there needs to be conversations about race and about race within all our places. Harrogate is a very different place to Bradford. Or to Kirklees. or to Calderdale. But actually, the conversation needs to be the same conversation in every place. So for me, that's the really important point. I go back to, we have got a really important role as leaders, whether you are a black chief executive or a white chief executive. We've all got important role as leaders to create an environment where people feel that they can speak up freely. But just going back to the point that you made, Usha, about sometimes when we're growing up and as we sort of travel through our lives, sometimes it can be difficult to have the confidence to speak up, and I would certainly agree with that. But sometimes it's also not about confidence. I think it's about recognizing who you're having that conversation with. So, for example, I recall when I first started as chief exec in Harrogate, I was out in the town, and an old lady stopped me and said, "You're the chief executive of Harrogate Council, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And then she said, and it was some people could have called it condescending, but said, and how are they treating you? My immediate response was, apart from the shock, was, well, actually, they're treating me okay. But actually, what lay underneath that was, I think, an unconscious bias that existed in her mind that as a black chief executive, that the organisation probably was, had a particular view and perhaps was not treating me in the right way. And I have to say, you couldn't be further from the truth, actually. Harrogate Borough Council, in my view, has been a model employer, and it values every single person within the organisation, regardless of colour. But I didn't feel able to challenge, not because I felt a lack of confidence in doing so, but I thought that a person of that age probably, shouldn't have been challenged. On reflection, I don't think age should have come into it, really, and that challenge should have been there. So it's not just about what we do within our own organisations. I suppose the point I'm making is that we have to carry that over into society every single day.
You're listening to Can You Hear Me? The podcast from the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership BAME Network.
Obviously, there's been a lot about Black Lives Matter, and I think Black lives don't often have the luxury of white privilege, as we've discussed earlier, and that, I think, is why saying Black Lives Matter is so important. But it seems to be making people uncomfortable. Saying Black Lives Matter is making uncomfortable. I think my next question, and I'd like to put that to you, Sam, is how do we challenge those who say all lives matters as a response to Black Lives Matter, to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, I think I'd say you're right and you're wrong. Okay, so of course, all lives matter. We wouldn't be doing what we do if we didn't think that all lives matter. And we've got to look at the full range of needs right across our communities. But what brought it home for me, actually, it was a picture of a young girl who was out on a march with her family, and she was holding a placard that says, Black Lives Matter, we didn't say that all lives didn't matter. And then I was talking to a really kind of dear friend who shared with me a really great kind of comic strip that talked about why Black Lives Matter, and it's not to say that all lives don't matter. And it used the example of the rainforest. So it said, actually, we campaign about the rainforests. They're really, really important. But we don't, on the back of that, say, but all forests matter, because of course they do. Trees are really important, but the rainforest is really important. But actually, to dismiss the point about Black Lives Matter with a counter of all lives matter shows a lack of knowledge and awareness of what the issues are here. you know, and I find that really difficult, even right now, you know, with coronavirus, when, you know, the BME population has been so disproportionately affected from a mortality perspective. You know, I know that if I went out and talked to all of my every BME friend I've spoken to has had an auntie, a nephew, a niece, somebody who has been affected by this. So it's something that I think needs to be tackled with a conversation. Can we talk about this actually? So again, going back to the point of seeking to understand, not judging, you've got it wrong, you know, and I'm going to really assert myself, but to go at it from an educational point of view, because I like to think that if I and I've had a couple of those conversations, leave those conversations with the other person going, well, do you know what? I think I get that now, actually.
Yeah.
And you're right, actually. I get that because I understand it. So explaining it is really important. And again, not judging and being quick to judge.
And I think that educational piece that you say is really important, because part of me thinks that why does it make people so uncomfortable saying Black Lives Matter and to say that all lives matter? Is it because perhaps it reminds us of race? Does it perhaps remind us of our history? Do you know, is there that lack of understanding around, you know, the history, you know, our history and how, you know, structural racism, institutional racism is actually present? And I'd like you to pick up on that, Rob, if you wouldn't mind. You know, what do you think of, what would you know, what's your response to those that say all lives matter?
Well, of course, all lives matter, but we've got a situation where clearly a huge number of people feel that society doesn't value Black lives and doesn't think Black lives matter. So how are we going to change that? And I can have an argument with you about the stats, and we can talk about the shocking statistics on arrests. We can talk about the shocking statistics around likelihood of being sectioned, secluded, segregated. We could talk about the shocking statistics on the impact of coronavirus. Do you want to start there? Or do you want to talk about how it must feel to be part of the generation that built the NHS, but then to be sent home because you couldn't find your granddad's passport? Do you want to talk about how it must feel to be, you know, from a population that were the worst victims in the Grenfell Tower disaster, and to feel like the response that hasn't been as fulsome as it could be, and that there's been a huge amount of noise and anxiety about getting on top of why, you know, the coronavirus has impacted upon people from BME communities more than white people. Where do you want to start with this to understand that we've probably got some work to do? That doesn't mean we don't have to focus on everything else as well. But if we sort this out, maybe we'll have a fairer, just and tolerant society that embraces diversity and sees it as a strength. Because that's what we should, because I think that's what we all want. There's a way of getting to this, which will give us an outcome that we all want. But, you know, I think I'd take a rational, but I might also take quite an emotional view. I think the other thing I'd say, okay, let me sit you down with a member of staff. So I was talking to a member of staff the other day. I just asked her, how are you in the wake of all of the George Floyd and everything that's going on? And she started to cry. And she said, I'm really worried about my son. I've got a teenage boy. What's his future as a Black boy? Just listen to that and tell me that we don't need to do something.
I'd like to bring you in now, Wallace. I mean, what do you think? How would you challenge those who say that all lives matter, you know, as a response to the BLM movement?
I think I would probably start by asking, when was the last time that you saw a white person murdered by somebody kneeling on their neck? I think that that's a really important starting point, because I think it would be difficult, if any, to point to a single instance where a white person was murdered by somebody kneeling on their neck. So of course, all lives matter, you know, and that's really, you know, the Black Lives Movement matter isn't trying to say that a black life is more important than a white life. But what they are clearly trying to say is that a black life matters equally as much as a white life, and that concept then needs to really just translate itself into every facet really of society. But I suppose there is an important point about why would somebody make that comment in the first place? And going back to the point that we have made constantly through this conversation, seeking to understand why that comment would need to be made in the first place. And I think what it perhaps underlies is this feeling that there isn't a recognition that white people in society faces disadvantage. And of course, white people in society suffer disadvantage. But the point that we need to constantly keep coming back to in this conversation is that they don't necessarily feel disadvantaged because of the fact that they've got a white skin. So, I think my view on this would be that there needs to be challenge to the fact that somebody would feel that they have to say that all lives matter, because all lives absolutely do matter. But the important thing is to recognise that what the Black Lives Movement is trying to say is that Black lives matter equally as much as white lives.
Yeah, thank you for that. What are your thoughts surrounding phrases such as colourblind? When people say that I'm not racist, I've got black friends. I'm not racist, I've got a Pakistani or Indian boyfriend. I'm not racist. I'm down with everybody, and I understand. And I think are these just innocent comments, or do they suggest that we're not perhaps seeing culture as being significant? And I'd like to put that to you first, Rob.
Thanks. Obviously, culture is hugely significant, and for me, there's something about the recurring theme of understanding people's comments. I mean, there's a difference between saying, I'm a multicultural person because I had a biryani once, and being fully embedded in the cultural understanding of a community. And cultural awareness and cultural competence are two entirely different things. And I think we've got to be culturally competent. But when it comes to things like colour blindness, I think we would want, for equality's sake, for us to say that the colour of someone's skin made no difference to a decision that was made around something that was in a fair process. But when it comes to understanding diversity as strength and the characteristics that people can bring to something, then obviously colour and culture make a massive difference. So being colourblind to that is being ignorant of the strengths that people can bring.
Yeah. Can I bring you in on that as well, Wallace? Would you like to add anything to that, to the colourblind phrase?
I don't think we should necessarily see the phrase colour blindness on its own as a negative phrase or a negative comment. I think it depends upon the context that it's being used in. So if it's being used as almost what I call a societal aspiration for us all to reach, so that we get to this point where there is equality regardless of race, culture. I think that the term colour blindness can be seen as a positive. So it really does, I think, depend upon the context. But I think too often when we talk about colour blindness, we do mix up race and culture, and we see them all as the same thing. And I think that they are actually different things. So for me, within the term colour blindness, I think racial equality and cultural equality are two things that should be brought out rather than necessarily seeing it as one. I suppose in much the same way that we talk about BAME communities almost as if we're a homogeneous group, and we're not, So it is important, I think, to just unpick what exactly we mean by the term colour blindness and understand the context that people are talking about it, and whether it's actually being used as an aspirational thing that can actually be a force for good, or whether it's being used really unconscionably in a way really that doesn't really understand what exactly colour blindness means, and we need to unpick and understand it and then have that conversation.
Thank you. And Sam, do you think, I mean, would you like to add your comments to that? Do you think colour blindness, is this an innocent comment? Is this somebody who has unconscious biases, perhaps, that they're not aware of? Or is this something that, you know, we perhaps don't understand the culture, you know, or don't see culture as being significant?
I mean, I suppose I'd say I think it's all of those things. And if I think about my childhood, I was, you know, working class roots, and my parents always instilled, I suppose, a value and a belief in me that, you know, if you put your mind to it, anything's possible. And I suppose for many, many years, I grew up in a context of we're all equal, and, you know, if you work really, really hard, you can achieve. And therefore had colour blindness, and, you know, I have to hold my hand up and say, you know, up until fairly recently, I would have said, oh, I don't see colour, you know, we're all equal and let's get along, and, you know, we work really hard, we can achieve anything. And it has literally only been for me in the last 2 to 3 years where I've, you know, read stuff, talked to people, listened to people, and really got to grips with how unequal our society is, actually, in many, many ways, race being probably the most unequal aspect of it, but there are other areas as well: gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic. And then you then look at the world, because, you know, I kind of grew up in this community and moved around. My father was in the forces, and it was very closeted and protected. So I just think we're all learning, really. So I think it's a combination of innocence, naiveness, a lack of understanding. So, you know, for me, and it all goes back to culture, the more we can talk to one another, listen to one another, celebrate and understand our differences, share our experiences with each other, the richer we will all become.
You're listening to Can You Hear Me, the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership BAME Network podcast.
I think organisations essentially are better and work at their best when there's a diversity of representation and thought at its heart, across its workforce, leadership and process of decision making. And one thing that, in the words of Eden Charles, who's one of the faculty members at the NHS Leadership Academy, and I don't know if you've come across some of his work, he's actually said, and I'm quoting him because it's such an important statement, in that leaders need to have a deep self-awareness, particularly focusing on their biases, beliefs and blind spots, in order that they can create workplaces fit to house the human spirit. So with that in mind, in a recent blog, Roger Klein, who wrote the initial article, The Snowy White Peaks of the NHS, which highlighted the scale of race discrimination within the NHS, has now stated that equality and diversity and inclusion must finally become core board business. And as board members, how are you going to use your position to support the progression within workplaces and provide developmental opportunities for BAME colleagues? And I'd like to come to you first, Wallace.
Okay, so I think there are probably a couple of points that I would say in response to that. The first is, use a quote from Gandhi earlier. I'm going to use a quote from Nelson Mandela earlier. I'm going to use a quote from Gandhi, and that is, you have to be the change that you wish to see in others. So it is about living and breathing and absolutely believing and in everything that we're talking about in terms of trying to sort of make a positive change to affect people from a Black and minority ethnic community, and translating that into everything that we do every single day. And I think for me that is really important. And I think the second one would be, for me, actually just being clear and understanding really where I wish to spend my energy to make that positive change for good, because it's actually really easy sometimes to be quite random in the approach, and wanting to be this voice in every circumstance, in every platform, and actually all that you end up doing is just diluting the effort that you're putting into it. So for me, it's about being very focused on where I choose to spend my energy. And forums like this is really important. I choose to spend my energy in forums like this. I choose to spend my energy in making sure that my organisation and the values that it aspires to lives and breathes diversity and equality and opportunities for people from a black and minority ethnic background. And I choose to be a champion that challenges at every opportunity. So that's really how I see that somebody in a leadership position like me can try and influence the agenda.
Thank you. And I'd like to put that question to yourself, Sam.
Yeah, although that's a hard act to follow. I think I'd like to be more like Wallace as a leader. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I think you've got to have intention around this. It's more than lip service. But the more I think deeply about this, the more I talk about it, the more I'm listening and learning from others, the more I see, for me, this is about culture. It's about shaping cultures in organisations. We talked about behaviours. The culture of an organisation is shaped by the worst behaviour a leader is willing to tolerate. So I need to kind of, I've been doing a lot of thinking about that, really, because I think probably we've tolerated too much there. And again, it's about getting the right balance, being absolutely clear where your red lines are. But we've done quite a lot of work in our organisation around diverse board. We've got a fantastic chair who's made some wonderful appointments to the board. So 22% of our board are Black, Asian, minority ethnic, 44% are female. And I think that we are really just starting to reap the benefits of that diverse representation in the boardroom that we didn't have previously. But equally, making sure, and again, I've got a job of work to do here, because it's something we've been talking a lot with our BAME networks on, making sure it's not all of our BAME staff doing the heavy lifting on this, that actually the load is equally distributed and everybody's taking up their responsibilities. And I think we've got some work to do there. So getting this running through the organisation like a stick of rock would be my number one aim, and everything wrapping around it being absolutely crucial. And I think, as we've touched on so much, developing cultures that are psychologically safe, that celebrate but recognise and understand diversity and difference in the workplace and the benefit that brings to our communities.
Thank you. And finally to you, Rob.
The metaphor I would use is, when we've seen the re-emergence of racist chanting at football matches, and often it's the black players who draw it to the attention of the referee and walk off. I want to be on a team where it's the white players that do that. And that's what we're trying to build here. We're trying to build a system in West Yorkshire and Harrogate, and a trust where everybody feels this. Everybody, I've got ethnicity. Everybody understands ethnicity and culture and the power and value of diversity. And the practical things that we've done here in the trust have been, and that I've done as the chief exec with the chair's support, is to make this debate about talent. And so if I hear yet again, we can't get people at director level or non-exec directors or band 8s or whatever from a BME population, I'll argue with anyone until the cows come home that people are there. So one of the things that we did early on was to change the way that we advertised so that it was more appealing to a more diverse group. And lo and behold, since I've been here 4 years, we've appointed 7 directors. 6 of them have been women and 3 of them have been from a BME background. And we didn't expressly go out and say we want people from BME background, but we made it clear that we would welcome people from diverse populations with a diverse set of skills that might have equivalent but not direct experience. So that really helps for a start. Now, one of the things that one of the staff said to me this week, and I'll repeat this is her words, not mine, so you'll have to forgive this if you don't think it's appropriate. But she said when she saw the first of those black directors appointed to the board, she ran into her colleague and said, "I can't believe it, there's a sister on the board."
Fantastic.
How fantastic is that? And she said, "I knew that this organisation was serious about change." So once you start to get that, then other people see that this is a place where you can come. And another person that I spoke to recently said, "Where there's a seat at the table for me." And that's the kind of culture that we're trying to bring. Then in West Yorkshire and Harrogate, we've been trying to do the same. And when we had our session on what's our approach going to be to having representative leadership across the whole of the ICS by 2025, we didn't do that ourselves. We asked the networks to do it. We asked the networks to assemble a group of Black, Asian, minority ethnic talent to tell us what to do. And when that talent came together, it was really impressive. And it was a visible symbol that if you think there isn't any talent, what's all this then? So I think that doing some of those, then having practical backups like shadow board, reverse mentoring, supporting some of the work of the Leadership Academy, all help create that combination of culture and practical support that we need. And then we have to support white colleagues to have the right kind of conversations and to understand their own fragility and privilege.
Can you hear me now? You've been listening to the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Health and Care Partnership BAME Network podcast. Join us again next time when we'll be joined by more diverse talent working to improve health and care for people in West Yorkshire and Harrogate.